The first exam is next week. It's already week 3 next week. And so it will be next Friday, a week from today, in here with your functioning laptops that have a fully charged battery. Okay, so it'll be an EduCat exam. You'll need to test your lockdown browser because we will do a lockdown browser. So make sure there's a quiz you can take in EduCat in my page there where you can test it to make sure it's working. And then make sure you've charged up your battery. And then it's the idea of, once we get going, I'll get here as close to, noon or before as I can. I teach right before this, so just be aware of that. And then I can stay later if need be, because there's no one in this room after us. So I can stay all the way up to 1 or a little later. And this first exam, remember, it most likely, well, I can practically guarantee you it's not going to be 100 points because we haven't covered that much material. But that's the point. I want you to take a test early so that it's a low risk process. Okay. So it'll be covering certainly all the way through water potential and probably most of transpiration. I will give you more info on that on Monday during lecture, okay? And so it'll be multiple choice, maybe some fill in the blank, maybe do some labeling of an image. It'll be at least 1 essay question, maybe 2. I haven't made it yet, so I will give you more feedback next week. Questions about the exam? So the way to approach any essay question on the exam, so you'll usually see that my essay question is a series of sentences where I'm saying, okay, here's the scenario. Okay, now answer this. And then based on that, answer this. And so I've had students in the past, and I would encourage it if it works for your brain to, like, as you're typing, you can even just, you don't have to do it in this lovely, beautiful paragraph format. If you just want to kind of, okay, here's a sentence, she's asking this, I'm going to answer that. Okay, now she's asking this, so I'm going to answer that, and so one of the biggest downfalls I see is that students won't answer the entire question that I've asked. They'll leave off something. And so I always tell you to slow down and read very carefully. And that goes for multiple choice too, but especially the essay. You have to make sure that you've answered every aspect I've asked you to answer. Okay? The beauty of essay is you get partial credit, right? So even if you get some of it wrong, you probably got some of it right. So at least you have that going for you. Whereas unfortunately with multiple choice, it's all or nothing. So other questions on the exam? Well, probably the latest I would say for this exam would be 1:30. And then, so that would give you an hour and a half essentially, which again, I don't think you'll need. But maybe for the second, third, or fourth exam, that would be handy. Looks like the way it works out, I think there's no one in before us on Wednesdays, and then there's no one after us on Fridays. So those would be the days I'd put exams. Monday doesn't work. Just thinking ahead. Other questions on the exam? Well, I have a question for you. This scenario. So water potential will be on the exam. And so here we have a situation, I drew it on the board as well. So you have a situation where I given, there's the water potential equation, psi sub W is equal to psi sub T plus psi sub S. You have a beaker that's not pure water. It has some glucose in it, let's say, and an overall water potential of negative 0.15. The plant cell that's about to be dropped into it has an overall water potential of negative 0.25. So I've drawn it on the board. So now I'm going to ask you just to be quiet as I show you the next slide and think. Don't say anything, don't talk to each other, just sit and think through it on your own. So which way will water move given that scenario? So if you drop that plant cell into the beaker, Think about what one is the right answer here. Don't say anything yet. All right. What do you think?
In the higher concentration.
From the less negative to the more.
Okay. So in this case, from the beaker into the cell is correct. And then I heard some people, saying why. And usually on an exam, I'd be asking for that. So you'd have to think about, okay, why did I pick that answer? What would be a good logical reasoning?
Water potential gradient.
Down the water potential gradient. So how else could you phrase it? That's correct. A less negative water potential to a more negative water potential. That's correct. And that's like the most precise way to phrase it. Less negative water potential to more negative water potential. If you start saying higher to lower, for some reason, I've seen students mess that up when I ask you for details. You start to switch things around. So I think it's better if you just stick with less negative to more negative. Okay. Okay, so now water is moving into the plant cell. What happens to the psi sub s component of the plant cell? Don't say anything, just think. Anyone want to hazard a guess?
I believe it'll become less negative.
It'll become less negative in the cell. So B is the correct answer. It becomes less negative because all that water is rushing into the plant cell. So your psi sub s, your solutes are getting diluted out. So anytime you have anything but pure water, anytime you dissolve a solute into the water, the glucose, some solute solution, immediately you have a psi sub s. It's some negative value. But if you have water now rushing into the plant cell, your psi sub s value, because you're getting more dilution effect, it's going to get less negative. It's going to approach zero. It won't be zero, but it's going to become less negative. Okay. What happens to the psi sub p of the cell? Water's rushing into an intact plant cell. What do you think the right answer is? A, B, C, or D? A, it increases. Your psi sub p, you have an intact plant cell, you have that lovely vacuole in there. That's the water's rushing into the vacuole. And if that big vacuole is pushing against the cell membrane, cell wall, everything's just getting that hydrostatic pressure into the cell. So your psi sub p is increasing. It's some positive number.
Why is it a positive?
Because it's a positive pressure of the water molecules pressing against the cell membrane. So it's a positive pressure of the water molecules building up against the cell membrane and the cell wall. Okay, so don't say anything yet, just think this through. What happens to the psi sub s component of the solution in the beaker as water is moving from the beaker to the cell? What will happen to your psi sub s? So just think about it. Okay, what do you think? A, B, C, or D? A is the correct answer. It's becoming more negative. Your psi sub s. Water is leaving the solution. You're concentrating now that solution in the beaker because water is leaving it. So your glucose solution is becoming more concentrated. That's going to drive your psi sub s more negative. It's going to become more negative. What happens to the psi sub p of the solution in the beaker? So this one's a little bit more thought. You have to think about what happened at the start of the experiment and then what's what would be going on at the end of the experiment. Size of P of the beaker. What do you think? A, B, C, or D? D, no change in value. So at the start of the experiment, it's an open beaker of solution. And so it's open to atmospheric pressure. So that means your size of P is 0. At the end of the experiment, I didn't say anything about putting some airtight thing on the beaker. It's still open to air. So your size of P is still 0. 0 at the start, 0 at the end. Okay. All right. So hopefully you got most of that right. But if you have not, if that did not happen, this is my cue to you to make sure you're studying this, because for sure this is going to show up on the exam in some form. Okay. So please spend some time, and then if you're having, like it's just not clicking with you, make an appointment with me. And if my office hours don't work, we'll find another time before Friday. Okay. But I really, really, really want you to learn this. I can post it. Yeah, I can post it. And in the notes section, the answers are in the notes section. But try to not look there first. Okay, so make sure to meet with me if you're still not quite confident on this. This is not going away. So the rest of the semester is going to be present. Okay. Yes, all the way back to the plant anatomy, structure, all the tissues and cells and all of that moving forward. Yep. Okay. So now we're going to get back into the slide set that we were covering on transpiration. And we said that water in the soil is under tension. So let's go back to the image, thinking about the roots in the soil. And it's the root hairs that do the vast majority of the intake of water and dissolved minerals and gases. And so they're showing the soil particles, the water in the soil. There's going to be some air pockets potentially if that soil is not saturated with water. And so you have to imagine the roots taking up the water and the dissolved minerals. And as they're doing that, you get the idea where there's going to be some more and more air gaps in the water here over time as the water is getting depleted right around the root zone. And so under that condition, when they were doing all the measurements, they could measure that the size of P was ending up negative. So it's a tension idea. The definition of tension is negative pressure. And so working through that idea, how could that happen? You have to appreciate that water has high surface tension to begin with. It's just a very interesting molecule. And so now imagine the roots are taking up the water and the dissolved minerals. And as the soil water is getting depleted right around the roots and it's starting to dry out, what you think about is all the water molecules that are in the middle of the pool of water in the soil. Though those water molecules are easily removed and taken up from the middle of the pores in the soil. Okay. But the water that's clinging to the soil particles because they of adhesion forces, don't forget about that. So you have adhesion forces to think about. You have to imagine those water molecules just latching on to the soil particles, and they don't want to immediately get taken up. They're happy clinging to the soil particles. And so what tends to happen under that state is that the bulk water will get taken up first. The water that's making contact with the soil particles stays longer. And you start to see the water, if you were to film that over time and watch what's happening, you would see the water starting to recede into tighter and tighter pore spaces in the soil system. And when that happens, it actually creates a curvature of the water molecules. And I'll show you a picture to get you thinking. And it's like the meniscus disc when you are measuring out a solution into a graduated cylinder. They always tell you to, you know, measure up to the bottom of the meniscus to get accurate. It's that idea. We're looking at that meniscus, but you have to imagine that happening between the soil particles. And that curvature like that can vary. How curved? Is it a very broad meniscus or is it curved more tight? You know, when you get into tighter pore spaces, it's going to be more tight. You get into big pore spaces, it'll be very broad. And so the idea here is you can measure that and actually calculate the tension based on the curvature of the meniscus. And so that's how tension is developing. So I'm going to show you the equation to prove it to you. So here is the equation. Psi sub P is equal to -2 times T divided by R, where T is the surface tension of water, which is just a value, if you want to know it, it's this, 7.28 times 10 to the -8 megapascals. And then the R is the radius of the curvature of the meniscus. And R is in the denominator, not the numerator. So that means the smaller the value, the bigger the overall tension. Okay, you have to do a little math thinking here. If you have a small number in the denominator, that's going to give you a big number when you do the calculation. So let me show you this comparison on the next slide to convince you. So here it is, there's the equation again. You have the psi sub P is equal to -2T divided by R, and then A, B, and C is showing you 3 different curvatures of the meniscus in the soil system. So A, when they measured the radius of the curvature, it's 0.5 micrometers, and you can see when they did the overall psi sub P calculation, it was -0.3. But as you work down into the more, where is it, pen? When you get a tighter curvature, like in B, you can see that your value is starting to get more negative. It dropped to -0.3. And then C is the most extreme, where it was a really small radius. It was only 0.01. And when you put that into the denominator and do the calculation, you get a whopping -15. So this is really good to study off of to convince yourself that as the curvature gets smaller and smaller, you get higher tension values, more negative tension values, which just means a really strong tension. Okay.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, that higher negative tension value will resist the shedding of water.
Correct. Correct. Yes, you're right. So the bulk water in the soil, it's like, yeah, I'll get evaporated, I'll get taken out, that's no problem, you know, because they're not clinging to the soil particles. But the water molecules clinging to the soil particles, it's a little tougher. And so it creates, you have to really get going with the tension. And so so as the roots are doing that, as the roots are taking up the water and the dissolved minerals, it's the soil particles right around the roots that are going to get the more narrow, smaller radius of the curvature of the menisci, right? And so right around the roots, you get this really negative tension because of that. But further out away from the roots, in just the bulk soil, where there aren't any roots, there'll be less tension. So really negative tension by the roots, less negative tension over somewhere else away, you have a gradient. So the first week we talked about 2 different equations, Fick's first law of diffusion and the Bose equation. Which idea are we thinking about here? Are we talking about delta C over delta X or delta P over delta X? Bulk flow, delta P over delta X. I just told you there's a gradient in the tension. Tension's negative pressure. So we're thinking about the ideas of bulk flow. And so the idea that bulk flow is the process of how water is moving. If you have plant roots there taking up the water, it's going to create a nice tension right around there, less tension further out. So you have a tension gradient, which is essentially negative pressure. So it's really a pressure gradient that we're thinking about. But it's a tension idea. It's negative pressure in the soil, not positive. It's negative pressure in the soil. So that's a little weird. compared to what we were talking about with, you know, the thought problem on the board here. So it's a pressure gradient idea to get that water moving from the bulk soil toward the roots. And so that's pretty handy. It's good news for the plant, because as long as the plant keeps going with taking up the soil water, hopefully that gradient is going to keep the water flowing toward the roots until, you know, there's severe drought, then the plant's in trouble. So they've done the fine measurements. They've looked at different kinds of roots, you know, the mature roots, the slender roots, the fat roots, the root hairs. They've done all kinds of measurements on water uptake. And excuse me, usually the tip area of the roots is the fastest uptake of water, and then the older portions of the roots has less. But just to let you know, they've really looked into it carefully. So now, if you can imagine the water coming, let's say, through the root hairs, well, all those water molecules still have to make it to the vascular tissue of the root, and so they still have a journey to get to the vascular tissue. And so they've tracked that too, like, how does that happen? And, you know, they can measure how rapid this happens. And so they're using a lot of experimental data to try to piece together this story. And basically, when they were looking at the situation, they said, well, you could have water just flowing through the cell wall space of all those cells in the root. Just, you know, skirting the cells, not going through the cells, just kind of skirting around all the cells through the cell wall space. If that's the method of transport or movement, we call it apoplast, and I do need you to know that term. Transmembrane is pretty much what it says. It means the water reaches a plant cell, goes through the cell wall, cell membrane, gets into the cytoplasm, flows across, goes through the cell membrane, through the cell wall, goes out, and does it all over again to the next cell. That's kind of laborious. And so they, you know, don't think transmembrane really is a huge part of water movement based on how fast water gets loaded into the xylem. That does not seem to be the preferred method. Then the other method, Symplast, and I need you to know that term. That's when the water, once it gets into the first cell, it'll just go through the internal tunnel plasmodesmata system from cell to cell to cell, which is easier than transmembrane. You just have to get into one cell and then boom, just use the internal tunnel system between cells, the plasmodesmata. So of the three, the apoplast and Symplast seem the most logical when they looked at the data of how fast water moves through the plant body. So here it is visually looking at the idea of the root hairs taking up the water. So the water looks like it's in green here, or no, blue, I guess. Green and blue, I guess. They did it two different ways. So the apoplast way is being shown in this area here, where you can see it's just skirting all of the cells. It's just going through the cell wall area. And so that's really fast when you do the experimental measurements. The other way over here, Symplast, they're trying to show anyways, that it's going through the tunnel system, the plasmodesmata. No matter what way you go, though, eventually you're going to reach the center of the root area where the vascular tissue is located. And we haven't talked about this yet. This endodermis. So that endodermis term, I need you to know that, please. So the endodermis term is right there on the top right. It's a ring of cells that has a very special waxy strip in the cell wall. Okay, it's suberin. They don't have that on here, do they? Suberin. Yeah, it's suberin is really waxy. And I always use the analogy of, like, if you have a package, a box, and you put a rubber band around it, and the rubber band represents the suberin. Think about that idea, where the box is your cell wall. And so that's what they're trying to show here, like this is the rubber band, right? And so it's in the cell wall area. And so if the water is moving apoplastically through the cell wall area and then it bumps into the suberin, it's like, I can't go through that. And so that forces any apoplast water, it'll bump into that and go, okay, I'm blocked. And then it'll have to go into the cell. And I'm not going to go into huge detail, but the design of the endodermis is really good. That suberin strip like that, that's really good because it forces water to go into the cells at that point, and it creates a situation. Again, I'm not going to go into the physics of it, but it creates a situation where water stays moving forward into the vascular tissue, which is what the plant wants. It doesn't want it to flow back out. All right, so it's creating a situation where the laws of physics is going to make sure that the water keeps going and going and going into the vascular tissue. So the suberin, the fancy word for that is the Casparian strip. I don't know if there was someone named Caspari, and so they named it after that person, but the Casparian strip is that strip of suberin. So apoplastically, movement can certainly happen through the rest of the root, but once it gets to the endodermis, that's the end of the road for apoplast, and then it has to dive in to the cells. But so now we have the water getting to the vascular tissue beyond the endodermis, and it has to get to the xylem and dump the water and dissolve minerals into the xylem. Is xylem living or dead? Dead. So hollow, right? Just empty. But that's great because that allows really rapid water movement through the plant body. So dead cells, so the xylem is composed of two types of cell types. What are they? Tracheids and vessels. Very good. So now I have had some students talk about positive pressure, that you can get positive pressure developing in plants. Yes, you can, but it's only under very special circumstances. All right, so this is a very special circumstance. And then I'm going to tell you how all the other circumstances, it's not positive pressure. So what you see here is a strawberry plant. Are strawberry plants tall or short? Short. If you've ever gone out digging or picking strawberries in the summer, get a sore back, sore knees. All right, short plants. So this is the special situation with really short plants, or your lawn grass that's short. Have you ever walked across your lawn in the early morning and your shoes get all wet and you're like, wait a minute, it didn't rain. Well, what you're experiencing is the dew, which is these water droplets coming off the blades of grass or the strawberry leaves. And it's because during the night, a situation arose where water got pushed up that short little plant, just that little bit, and then oozed out. And so you get positive pressure under those conditions can allow for the dew to form on your grass. Okay, but it's with really short plants, and it has to be under the situation where you have cool nights and no drought in the soil, and so there's several circumstances that have to be met. So yes, you can have positive pressure developing in the xylem, and plant physiologists knew about this, and they're like, well, that's probably how it works all the time. When they're trying to figure this all out, they're like, positive pressure, yes, okay, let's go have a beer. And then they started doing the measurements, and they're like, oh no, it's not positive pressure, except under very particular conditions. So they went back to the drawing board and they said, well, okay, let's take some more measurements. Let's see what we got. And so they had to take into account the size of the xylem, the diameter of the xylem, the frictional forces of the xylem walls, and they got into water and just all of its unique properties. And then they did some measurements of water movement through the plant from the root to the leaves. So they had to look at all of this in detail and come up with a different idea, a different hypothesis that they could test. And it ended up being called the cohesion tension theory. Cohesion tension theory. And this is the most widely accepted theory of how water moves through the plant body most of the time. Cohesion, and then there's the tension word. So cohesion is the idea that water molecules are very attracted to each other. They like to hang out with each other. Tension is that negative pressure idea that we've already talked about in the soil. So what do we got going on here? So here you're seeing the drawing of a leaf, and you have the inner portion of the leaf being kind of blown up so you can look at it. So you see that you have the upper surface, epidermal cells on the upper surface. You have these really cool palisade cells all packed together, and then you have this section inside the leaf where it's mostly spongy mesophyll cells that are more loosely scattered around. You have a lot of air gaps in here. Here they're showing some guard cells in the pore on the bottom of the leaf. So here are your stomata. And you're seeing if the pores are open, like what's being drawn here, the CO2 is coming in for photosynthesis. That's great. And then the other idea here is that you have water vapor leaving, exiting the leaf, leaving the leaf, exiting the leaf, okay? So that is by default. You open your stomata, you're gonna get water loss, guaranteed. So it is a big deal for a plant to make that decision to open. Should I open my stomata or not? And they have to rely very heavily on what's going on with the roots and the soil water and respond appropriately. All right, so let's say the stomata are open. You have water vapor exiting the leaf. Okay, so what's going on here? All right, so the roots took up the water and the minerals, brought it into the root tissue, got it loaded into the xylem. Now it's on the super internal highway. The water, remember that the cohesiveness of the water molecules makes it so that once the water is getting into the xylem, it acts like a big column of water, intact water. It's just going to flow all together en masse through the xylem. And it keeps going, gets to the leaves, the veins in the leaf, which is right here, the vascular tissue. And then the water starts to ooze out of the xylem and gets into the internal leaf space. So now you have to imagine water molecules oozing out here. And what they're going to do is start clinging to the surface of the cells in that leaf. And depending on how much oozes out at once, you might get some in the bulk area a little bit, a little bit of layers of water molecules building up in there. But as that water is evaporating out of the leaf, you're going to create a situation very similar to what we just talked about in the soil, where instead of soil particles and the water clinging to the soil particles, now we're talking about the leaf cells, the spongy ones in particular, the spongy mesophyll cells. So there's those adhesive forces where the water is clinging to the spongy mesophyll cells, but the pores are open, stomata are open, so water is evaporating into the bulk airspace here and zooming out of the leaf. So as that keeps happening, you can imagine where the water is going to start to recede as it's getting used up and evaporated out. It's going to recede into tighter and tighter cracks and crevices in the leaf area. And again, you have to think about the curvature of the meniscus. It's going to start to get smaller radius, smaller as it recedes into tighter and tighter spaces. Just very similar to what we just talked about with what's happening in the soil. Very, very similar. So we're still thinking about these ideas. It's just now we're up into the inside of the leaf. Magic School Bus? Ever watched the Magic School Bus? I always imagine, what's the teacher's name? Miss Frizzle. I love that show. And when my boys were little, I just loved watching that with them. I always imagine being Miss Frizzle, going into the leaf and imagining, all this water starting to get used up and get sent out through the stomata, and you get that receding water into the tighter and tighter spaces. So your radius gets smaller and smaller, and that really allows for some nice tension in the leaf. So all these water molecules are connected because of cohesion with each other. They like to be with each other, right? So all of these molecules are connected, and they're connected to all the water molecules oozing out of the xylem. And those water molecules are connected to all the water molecules behind them waiting their turn, all the way down through the xylem to the roots, all connected. So it moves en masse. And as long as it's all connected like that, what's happening is you get this nice tension starting to develop in the leaf because of the smaller and smaller radii, the evaporation going on. And that tension in the leaf can be felt all the way through the xylem, all the way to the roots. You get a tension gradient, really strong tension in the leaves. But as you move away from the leaf and get into like the branches, the tree trunk, down to the roots, you get less and less tension. So now you have a tension gradient, delta P over delta X, bulk flow. So as long as those water molecules are all connected with each other through cohesive forces, it'll work. And they've measured it. They can measure tension in the leaf tissue, and they see really nice negative tension in the leaf, and then they measure it down in the root, less tension. And so you have that gradient. As long as that gradient is maintained, you'll get water moving continually up from the roots through the tree trunk, branches into the veins of the leaf, and then ultimately out of the leaf. Here's another look at comparing the different radii sizes. Okay, so I really, really encourage you to play with this a little. I'm not going to ask you to like calculate stuff out, but knowing this equation and playing around with it a little bit will convince you of what I'm talking about here, that with the smaller radius, you get really good tension, which is negative pressure. Questions on this idea? Okay, so very, very similar to what we just said was going on in the soil. It's just now you have to imagine being in amongst the spongy mesophyll cells in the leaf, inside the leaf. So all of this is kicking off. Remember, I started the story by saying the stomata are open. That's where I started the story, or how it's developing in the plant. What happens if the stomata close? What do you think is going to happen to the tension? I think I have my, darn it. So it's going to stop, right? Your tension, maybe a good way to say it would be release the tension. The tension would get released. Maybe that's a good way to think about it. So it's kind of, I don't have my rubber band with me. It broke and I forgot to put it back, a new one. You can imagine, like, I always imagine a rubber band, like if you're holding a rubber band and the top would be the leaf and you're pulling on the leaf and the rubber band stretching, that's your column of water. You're putting like a tension on the rubber band. That's your column of water when the pores stomata are open. You close the stomata, it's like releasing the rubber band. It just, the tension just releases. And that's what they see happening. So really, to kick all of this off, to get water moving through the plant body, you have to have the stomata open. Otherwise, the tension, the water column's just kind of sitting there going, yeah, I don't feel any force to get me moving. I'm just going to sit here. Yes. There's no water flow. So at night, the typical plant at night closes its stomata. That's an important concept. A lot of people don't understand. So the typical plant, and so there's different plants. C3 plants are what I'm talking about for those of you who have had Plant Kingdom. So C3 plants, that's what majority of what we have here are native to this area. At night, they're not doing this. They've closed their stomata to conserve water, primarily because the other reason to open your stomata is to take in CO2. But the other thing a lot of people don't realize, photosynthesis can't happen at night at all. All right, because some of the key enzymes need light to function in some of the enzymes involved in photosynthesis. So if you're a plant, a typical C3 plant, you're like, well, I'm not going to do photosynthesis. I don't do photosynthesis at night. Would you want to leave your stomata open? No, that makes no sense because you're losing water automatically. So at night, it makes sense to just kind of take a nap. I'm going to stop photosynthesis because I need light to fully do it. And I don't want to keep my pores open. I could get dehydrated. I can't just go walk to the refrigerator and get more water. Okay. So at night, they'll close their stomata, so you won't have water open. So does it make sense to water your plants late in the evening before you go to bed? I try never to do that because you're creating a situation. They won't even take it up. Even if my plant is wilty, which often happens, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'll water you tomorrow morning, because I worry that even if a wilty plant at my house, if I water it at night and I don't have a super clean house, but there's a reason for that. I have science to back me up on that. I don't have to be super clean. I'm vindicated. So my house is not super clean. I know there's fungal spores around, and some of those fungal spores might like my plant. And you just watered your soil. You created a nice moist environment for fungi to start growing, the bad fungi to start growing overnight. And so mildew, and there's all kinds of fungal diseases out there. So don't water your plants at night, even if it looks wilty. Resist. Do it in the morning. So in order for transpiration, which is the movement of water through the plant body, in order for transpiration to occur, the stomata must be open. Have I convinced you? Okay. And a lot of people just don't have that knowledge, and they don't understand that. But once you learn, it really does make sense for a typical C3 plant to close down stomata. And as soon as they do that at night, when they close down at night, it releases the tension. And so everything just kind of, with water movement, just kind of comes to a standstill. Okay. So I said, so it's the cohesion tension theory. Cohesion means those water molecules like to, they're super attracted to each other. And I said how it's a column of water, en masse, just a whole bunch of water molecules all connected together. Well, sometimes you can get a situation where you might end up with the water molecules not in a total continuous column. So here you're seeing a cluster of vascular tissue. Here are some tracheids, here are the wider diameter vessels, and they're showing how, when you look at vascular tissue in the plant, it's all clustered, which is good because water can flow, and then if there's some kind of situation in one of the tracheids or vessels, they can reroute. And so here you're just seeing, well, here's a reroute right there, and some rerouting here. So what can happen sometimes is that the plant is doing transpiration. Let's say it's the middle of the day in July, it's hot, we haven't had rain. And so the roots are like taking up water, and then they're like, ooh, we're running low on water in the soil. Oh boy, it's getting bad. That ends up creating a situation where there's pretty good tension gradient to the point where the dissolved gases in the water, in the plant, in the xylem, pop out of solution. And if you've ever done that in chemistry where you have gases dissolved in water and then you put it under tension, it causes bubbles to pop right out of the solution. So if you have continuous column of water and then all of a sudden enough tension force happens where it creates a bubble, that bubble expands in this case, the vessel. And then here you can see it, the trachea. It expands quite quickly. And there's the word for it. Cavitation, a cavitated, gas-filled cavitated vessel. So the fancy word is cavitation. That's analogous to an embolism in the human blood vessel system, which is not good, right? I mean, I think most of us appreciate you wouldn't want an embolism. So plants don't want that either. So you've created a huge air bubble here. Whoops, now what? Well, it's not a total crisis because of the clustering of the vessels and tracheids, they can reroute around the bubble. So the water can't move past the bubble. It's going to come up to the bubble and go, whoops, and then it has to reroute. And so if you have that nice cluster, you can do that. They didn't really show it here by the drawing, but it's much easier to get a cavitation to occur in vessels compared to tracheids. Can you think of why? Because they're wider. It's just a bigger risk. That wider diameter, it's a bigger risk. It's easier for them to pop out of solution in that kind of scenario rather than a small little trachea. So vessels, plants in the spring, as they're growing more vascular tissue in the spring, when there's lots of water in the soil, if they're an angiosperm where they can do both tracheids and vessels in the spring, they'll lay down a bunch of vessels. Like, I want vessels because it's more efficient water flow. So that's huge. Vessels are good because you have really good water flow because of the wider diameter. There's less frictional forces. So in the spring, they'll say, I'm going to lay down vessels. I'm going to go with that because I have all this water in the soil. And then summer, late summer, as more and more drought occurs, they'll switch to making more tracheids because they're trying to minimize cavitation impact.
This can be remedied.
Exactly. So now you're thinking, okay, so tension pulled that gas out of solution, created that awful bubble in cavitation. But then at night, they close their stomata, and we were just talking how tension releases. That might be enough to drive the bubble back into solution overnight. It might take a while, but it might allow for the bubbles to dissolve. So it's not the end of the world, but having said that, by the end of summer, there's usually a lot of vessels that are tanked. The bubbles are just too much. And so they just give up on that, and it just never goes back into solution. But it's okay because they have a lot of vessels and tracheids. They usually have, angiosperms usually do a mix of tracheids and vessels. They kind of hedge their bets. And they go, yeah, I love vessels, but tracheids will get the job done under stress of water. Okay, so, but really this is all happening. You have to start at the leaves to think about how this is all happening. And you have to think about the stomata being open. And then as soon as that happens, water starts evaporating into the leaf tissue and exiting out through the stomata. That's what generates the tension. And then the cohesive forces of water keeps everything moving en masse, as long as there's no air bubbles in the way. Okay, so think about that over the weekend. Think about water potential a little bit. And we'll continue on with this on Monday.
You said angiosperms.
Yeah.
What if it's like an